silence. That's what follows every avoidant after they've closed the door on love. But what you don't understand, what no one tells you, is that this silence is not empty. It's teeming with thoughts, calculations, and a peculiar dance between relief and regret that would fascinate even the most seasoned psychologist. Today, we're diving deep into the shocking truth about what avoidants think after a breakup. And I promise you, it's nothing like what you imagine. You see, there's a curious phenomenon at play here, something psychologists call the curiosity gap, that irresistible pull we feel when there's a void in our understanding, a missing piece in the puzzle of human behavior. When someone walks away from love with apparent ease, when they seem to vanish into thin air emotionally, we become consumed with knowing what's really happening behind that carefully constructed wall of indifference. This gap in our knowledge gnaws at us, doesn't it? And coupled with our natural negativity bias, our tendency to focus on the worst possible interpretations of someone's actions, we often conclude that avoidants simply don't care, that they're heartless, that the relationship meant nothing to them. But here's where it gets fascinating, and dare I say, shocking. The avoidant mind after a breakup is like a master chess player who's just sacrificed their queen. To the observer, it looks like madness, like they've thrown away their most valuable piece. But inside their mind, they're calculating 17 moves ahead, weighing risks and benefits, trying to protect their king, their sense of self, at all costs. They're not unfeeling, they're overfeeling in a way that terrifies them so deeply they'd rather amputate the emotional limb than risk the infection of vulnerability spreading through their entire being. The shocking truth is that avoidants don't think less after a breakup. They think more, obsessively more. They replay conversations, analyze every moment of weakness they showed, every crack in their armor that you might have glimpsed. They're conducting a post-mortem on their emotional exposure, cataloging every instance where they let you too close, promising themselves it won't happen again. While you're wondering if they ever loved you, they're systematically filing away every reason why love is dangerous, why connection is a luxury they can't afford, why solitude is not just preferable but necessary for survival. This isn't cruelty, it's sophisticated emotional archaeology. They're excavating their own hearts, examining each artifact of affection like it's evidence in a case they're building against future vulnerability. The irony is exquisite, really. The very depth of feeling that once drew them to you becomes the source of their retreat. They don't leave because they don't care. They leave because they care so much it threatens the very foundation of how they've learned to exist in the world. What we'll explore today will challenge every assumption you've made about avoidant behavior. We'll journey into the labyrinth of their post-breakup mind, understand the intricate mechanisms of their emotional self-preservation, and discover why their apparent indifference is actually the most elaborate form of self-protection you've ever witnessed. By the end of this exploration, you'll see that the shocking truth about what avoidants think after a breakup isn't that they think nothing. It's that they think everything, feel everything, and then systematically convince themselves that thinking and feeling nothing is the only way to survive love's inevitable disappointments. Let me tell you about a woman named Victoria, a brilliant architect who could design the most beautiful spaces but couldn't inhabit emotional intimacy for more than a few months at a time. Victoria had a pattern, you see. She would fall deeply, passionately, terrifyingly in love, and then, just when her partner began to relax into the relationship, just when they started planning futures and speaking in plural pronouns, she would find a reason to leave. Always a good reason, always rational, always devastating. Her last relationship was with a gentle soul named David, a literature professor who read poetry aloud on Sunday mornings and remembered the anniversary of her mother's death with flowers and silence. For 8 months, Victoria allowed herself to believe in the possibility of permanence. She kept a spare toothbrush at his apartment, contributed to conversations about vacation plans, even entertained the dangerous notion of introducing him to her sister. But then came the moment that changed everything. David casually mentioned that he'd started looking at engagement rings. Not a proposal, mind you, just a mention, a gentle testing of waters. To anyone else, it might have been a romantic confession, a sweet glimpse into his intentions. But to Victoria's avoidant mind, it was a fire alarm in the night. Within 2 weeks, she had convinced herself that David was too controlling, too needy, too interested in changing her. She excavated evidence from months of contentment, the time he'd suggested they spend Saturday together when she had planned to reorganize her closet, the way he'd looked slightly hurt when she'd gone to her friend's birthday party alone, his habit of texting good morning before she'd had her coffee. The breakup conversation lasted exactly 12 minutes. Victoria delivered it with the precision of a surgeon, clean cuts designed to minimize suffering for both parties. She explained that they wanted different things, that she valued their time together but needed to focus on her career, that she hoped they could remain friends. David sat there, bewildered, trying to reconcile the woman who had traced his jawline in morning light just days before with this composed stranger delivering his dismissal with PowerPoint efficiency. What David couldn't see, what no one could see, was Victoria's internal earthquake. As she spoke those measured words of ending, her mind was simultaneously calculating the emotional damage she was inflicting and protecting herself from it. She was thinking about how his eyes crinkled when he laughed at her terrible jokes, how he made tea exactly the way her grandmother did, how safe she felt falling asleep next to him. But she was also thinking about her parents' bitter divorce, about her college boyfriend who'd cheated with her roommate, about every romantic movie that ended with the credits rolling before the real work of love began. In the days that followed, while David told his friends he didn't understand what had happened, Victoria was conducting the most thorough emotional audit of her life. She replayed every conversation, looking for signs that she'd revealed too much, become too dependent, shown too many cards. She remembered the evening she'd cried in front of him after a difficult day at work, and she catalogued it as evidence of weakness. She thought about the morning she'd made him breakfast in bed, and she filed it under excessive investment. Every tender moment became proof of her temporary insanity, every gesture of love transformed into a cautionary tale. But here's what made Victoria's situation particularly poignant. She wasn't just thinking about what she'd lost. She was thinking about what she'd avoided losing. In her mind, she had performed a preemptive amputation, cutting off a limb before the infection of intimacy could spread to her vital organs. She convinced herself that David would have eventually disappointed her, that the relationship was destined to fail, that she had simply been brave enough to face reality before reality faced her. The most shocking part of Victoria's post-breakup experience wasn't her apparent lack of emotion. It was the sheer volume of emotion she was processing in isolation. While David was reaching out to friends, crying over old photographs, and allowing himself to grieve publicly, Victoria was conducting a private intensive course in emotional suppression. She was feeling everything David was feeling, plus the additional weight of knowing she had chosen this pain, plus the exhausting effort of pretending she hadn't. 3 months later, Victoria would see David at a bookstore, browsing the poetry section with a new woman. The sight would trigger what she later described as an emotional avalanche. All the feelings she'd been systematically burying came rushing to the surface at once. But instead of recognizing this as evidence of her deep capacity for love, she interpreted it as confirmation of her decision to leave. After all, if seeing him happy with someone else hurt this much, imagine how much worse it would have been if she'd stayed and he'd eventually left her. This is the paradox of the avoidant mind after a breakup. They create the very abandonment they fear to avoid the possibility of experiencing it unexpectedly. They choose the devil they know over the devil they don't. And in their minds, this isn't self-sabotage, it's sophisticated risk management. They're not running from love. They're strategically retreating from the inevitable battlefield where love becomes loss, where connection becomes disappointment, where vulnerability becomes weaponry in someone else's hands. Understanding this internal landscape is crucial because it reveals that avoidants don't think less after a breakup. They think differently. Their thoughts are filtered through a complex system of emotional protections that transforms every memory into either evidence of their wise escape or proof of love's inherent dangers. They're not heartless. They're heart protective in the most elaborate way imaginable. Now that we've glimpsed into the complex inner world of post-breakup avoidant thinking, let's explore some practical approaches for understanding and potentially reconnecting with someone who loves through the lens of self-protection. But first, let me be exceptionally clear about something. These insights are not manipulation tactics. They're not strategies for forcing someone back into a relationship they've chosen to leave. Rather, they're tools for understanding, for creating space for authentic healing, and for approaching avoidant individuals with the kind of emotional intelligence that respects their protective mechanisms while gently challenging their assumptions about love's inevitability to disappoint. The first principle you must understand is what I call the paradox of pursuit. Your natural instinct after an avoidant breaks up with you is to chase, to prove your love, to demonstrate that you're different from everyone who has ever hurt them. This is perhaps the most counterproductive approach possible. Remember, the avoidant mind is currently cataloging every reason why they were right to leave, and your pursuit becomes evidence supporting their case. They think, "See, I told myself they were too clingy, too needy, too invested in changing my mind." Your desperation, however genuine and heartfelt, becomes their justification for the breakup. Instead, practice what I call strategic spaciousness. This doesn't mean playing games or following arbitrary no-contact rules you've read online. It means giving them the psychological space to recognize what they've actually lost, rather than providing them with evidence of what they were right to avoid. When you stop chasing, something fascinating happens in the avoidant mind. The thing they were running from, your need, your emotional investment, your desire for connection, suddenly isn't pursuing them anymore. This creates a cognitive dissonance. If you were truly as needy and overwhelming as they convinced themselves, wouldn't you be fighting harder for them? The reasoning behind this approach is rooted in basic psychology. Avoidants are attracted to what feels scarce and repelled by what feels abundant or available. When you chase them, you become abundant, always there, always available, always emotionally present. But when you create space, you become scarce again. More importantly, you become mysterious. Remember the curiosity gap I mentioned earlier? When you stop providing them with constant information about your emotional state, when you stop trying to convince them of your worth, their minds naturally begin to fill in the blanks. And here's the crucial part. They often fill in those blanks more favorably than the reality of your desperate pursuit. The second principle involves understanding what I call the evidence reversal technique. While they're busy collecting evidence of why the breakup was necessary, you need to be living evidence of why it might have been a mistake. But this isn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It's about becoming the version of yourself that attracted them in the first place. Independent, fulfilled, mysterious, and slightly out of reach. This is challenging work because it requires you to actually become these things, not just perform them. Focus intensively on your own growth and interests. Take up that hobby you always talked about but never started. Pursue that career opportunity that excited you. Reconnect with friends you may have neglected during the intensity of the relationship. The goal isn't to make them jealous. Jealousy often repels avoidance because it feels manipulative and needy. The goal is to become genuinely fulfilled in your own life, to demonstrate that you're not desperately incomplete without them. This is attractive to avoidance because it suggests that choosing to be with you is a preference, not a necessity born of your emotional neediness. The third principle is perhaps the most sophisticated: emotional Aikido. In martial arts, Aikido involves redirecting your opponent's energy rather than opposing it directly. In dealing with avoidant post-breakup behavior, this means working with their protective mechanisms rather than against them. When they say they need space, you don't fight it. You agree and take even more space than they requested. When they say they need to focus on themselves, you demonstrate that you're doing the same thing. This approach is effective because it removes the resistance they expect from you, which was part of their justification for leaving. Here's the deeper reasoning behind emotional Aikido. Avoidants are often unconsciously testing whether you'll respect their boundaries or try to override them. Every time you push against their stated needs, you confirm their belief that relationships involve losing autonomy and being controlled by someone else's emotions. But when you not only respect their boundaries but take them even more seriously than they do, you demonstrate a level of emotional maturity and self-control that's incredibly attractive to the avoidant mind. The fourth principle involves what I call intermittent positive reinforcement, but applied with tremendous sophistication and authenticity. Occasionally, and I mean rarely, you might share something positive happening in your life, or briefly acknowledge a good memory you shared together. But this must be done without any expectation of response and without any agenda of reconciliation. The key is that these communications should add value to their life, not drain energy from it. For example, if you see an article about something they're passionate about, you might share it with a simple message like, "This made me think of your project. Hope you're well." Then you disappear again. No follow-up, no expectation of response, no emotional weight attached to the gesture. This is effective because it demonstrates that you think of them positively, that you're not angry or bitter, and that you're capable of caring about their interests without needing anything in return. It plants seeds of maybe I misjudged their emotional neediness in their minds. The fifth and perhaps most important principle is what I call becoming the exception to their rule. Avoidants have developed their protective strategies based on past experiences where love led to pain, where vulnerability led to exploitation, where emotional investment led to disappointment. Your job isn't to argue with their history, it's to quietly, consistently demonstrate that their generalized beliefs about relationships don't apply to you specifically. This requires an almost superhuman level of patience and emotional regulation. You must show, through your actions over time, that you're capable of loving them without losing yourself, of wanting them without needing them, of caring deeply while still maintaining your own independence and fulfillment. This is the only way to bypass their intellectual defenses, because you're not trying to convince them with words. You're providing them with new experiential evidence that challenges their fundamental assumptions about how relationships work. The reasoning behind becoming the exception is that avoidants don't usually change their minds through argument or persuasion. They change their minds through experience. If every relationship they've ever had has followed a predictable pattern, initial passion, increasing demands for closeness, eventual disappointment and pain, then they need to experience something genuinely different to consider that their protective strategies might be unnecessary with you. Remember, all of these approaches require you to be genuinely committed to your own growth and healing, not just performing growth to win someone back. The most attractive quality to an avoidant is authentic independence, the sense that you're choosing them from a place of strength and fulfillment, not from a place of need and emptiness. If you're only pretending to be independent while secretly waiting for them to return, they'll sense the inauthenticity, and it will reinforce their decision to leave. As we reach the end of our journey into the labyrinth of the avoidant mind after a breakup, I want you to sit with the profound shift in understanding we've accomplished together. When you began this exploration, you likely saw avoidant behavior as evidence of indifference, perhaps even cruelty. Now you understand it as evidence of the opposite, such deep feeling that it requires the most elaborate protection system the human psyche can construct. The shocking truth about what avoidants think after a breakup is that they think everything, feel everything, and then perform the exhausting daily task of convincing themselves they think and feel nothing. They're not heartless, they're heart protective to a degree that would be almost admirable if it weren't so ultimately self-defeating. They don't leave because the relationship meant nothing to them. They leave because it meant so much that staying felt like standing in a burning building, hoping the flames wouldn't eventually consume them. This understanding should fundamentally change how you approach relationships with avoidant individuals, but more importantly, it should change how you approach your own healing after such relationships end. You now know that their departure wasn't a referendum on your worth, your lovability, or your relationship's potential. It was a statement about their capacity to tolerate the terrifying vulnerability that real love requires. Their leaving says nothing about you and everything about their relationship with intimacy itself. If you choose to implement the principles we've discussed, strategic spaciousness, evidence reversal, emotional aikido, intermittent positive reinforcement, and becoming the exception to their rule, do so from a place of genuine self-development, not manipulation. These approaches work because they represent authentic emotional maturity, not because they're clever tactics for winning someone back. The goal isn't to trick an avoidant into returning. It's to become the kind of person who doesn't need anyone to return in order to feel whole and fulfilled. And here's perhaps the most important insight of all. Whether or not your avoidant ever comes back, the work you do to become more secure, more independent, more emotionally regulated, and more genuinely fulfilled will transform every relationship in your life. You'll become attractive not just to the person who left, but to anyone capable of recognizing and appreciating emotional maturity. You'll develop the kind of inner strength that makes love a choice rather than a need, connection a preference rather than a desperate requirement. Remember that some avoidants, despite your best efforts and personal growth, will never be ready to choose love over protection. This isn't a failure on your part. It's simply where they are in their journey. Your job isn't to heal their attachment wounds or convince them that love is safe. Your job is to become so genuinely secure and fulfilled in your own life that you can offer authentic love without attachment to outcome, genuine care without the desperate need for reciprocation. The most profound relationships happen when two people choose each other not from emptiness seeking fulfillment, but from fullness seeking to share abundance. Whether your avoidant ever returns or not, you now have the tools to create that kind of fullness in your own life. You understand that their behavior isn't about you, and more importantly, your worth isn't determined by their ability to recognize it. Take these insights, use them wisely, and remember that the most attractive thing you can be to anyone, avoidant or otherwise, is someone who doesn't need them to be happy, but would genuinely enjoy sharing that happiness with them. That's not just the key to potentially reconnecting with an avoidant. That's the key to every meaningful relationship you'll ever have. The shocking truth about what avoidants think after a breakup has revealed something even more valuable. The truth about what you're capable of becoming in love's aftermath.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.